Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This is part 2 of this Shinto body mandala series as we speak. And the first video was really focusing on the Buddhist concept of body mandala that you find in like the Tada Genji teachings and in the Shotoku Jingunden teachings. And how that, even though that's a very Buddhist concept, you do find a parallel, a similar concept within the Shinto Jingunden teachings, such as the Tachibana Jingunden. Now in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of break away from the body mandala per se and move into sort of connected traditions, but we're still keeping on the Shinto aspect, basically. So even though this is part 2 of the body mandala series, it's really not about the body mandala anymore, and this is going to be more about sort of Shinto deities of the Jingunden and how they're related to the Jingunden. So what we want to do now is this video is going to look at the three goddesses, and we're also going to take a moment to look at Susano, and we're going to take a moment to look at one of Susano's descendants who becomes the god of the army. So let's start the story with Susano appearing to Amaterasu. Now, if you'll remember in a previous video, I had said that the three goddesses, these are the three goddesses of the Jingunden, very important deities within the Jingunden, and they come from an event that happened between Susano and Amaterasu. So here's the story in a simplified form. So it begins with Susano appearing to Amaterasu after he was exiled. So Susano would cause some problems. He was supposed to leave. He's actually supposed to go to Ne no Kuni, the land of the dead, so to speak, the land of the roots. But he sort of wandered around a bit. He didn't actually retire to there. He wandered around a bit, some stories about where he went, etc. And he comes back to his sister. Now, what's really cool is that when she realizes that he's on his way, this is not this is the Jingunden version of the Amaterasu. This is the version. This isn't this sort of you know very quiet, hiding behind the rock version. This is the version of an Amaterasu that's actually considered her real form, and in the Jingunden, this is the form that is utilized. But she takes on warrior attire. She's fully armed. She's got bow, arrows, swords, armor, beaded necklaces, beaded arm bangles. She's ready to fight Susano. She performs a warrior dance that like causes the earth to shake. It displays her godly strength, and she is ready to rip Susano in half. But Susano clearly says that he's not there to fight. He's there to prove that he's not actually a bad deity. He's not actually a bad guy. That there's just been like a giant misunderstanding. He's not really an evil god. And so, in order to prove these words, they agree to conduct a ritual. And this ritual that they've agreed to conduct is basically an oath ritual. And it's going to cause these three goddesses, these deities, to emerge from the body mandala of the sun goddess. Now, in this particular ritual, the sun goddess is going to emerge deities and Susano is going to emerge deities. And basically the rules are this: if Susano is lying about whether he's evil or not, he will produce female deities. If he's telling the truth, then he will produce male deities. So Susano gives the sun goddess his sword, one of his swords, gives her a sword. She then chews the sword up and then spits it out. From the spit arise three female deities. These are the three female deities of the Jingunden. These are them. Then she gives Susano her divine jewel. She has a necklace made of divine beads, like Magatama beads. She gives him this necklace. He then chews the necklace up, spits it out. And from that spit arise male deities. Now, in one version of the story, it's 5 deities. There's another version that says 6, but it's many male deities arise from his spit, which means that he's been telling the truth, because the whole point he's come to apologize and prove that he's not innately an evil deity, and this oath ceremony proves it. So the male deities that produced from his spit were sent to the heavenly realms, and the three goddesses were assigned to Earth. And at the time when they were assigned to Earth, the Sun Goddess basically told them that they are at this time they are to basically be on standby, so that when the day ever comes that any of her descendants, imperial descendants, need their help, that they are to go into action. So it is at the end of this oath ceremony where they become the three goddesses of the Jingunden. Now they don't go into action yet, because they don't go into action until Emperor Jimmu creates a military campaign. That's when they actually really sort of snap into action. But this is where they're created, and this is where they're given their divine directive. Now, after this event, some of you who are familiar with sort of the standard Shinto history would know that, may or may not know, that after this event is when Susano ends up still causing a lot of trouble and making problems for with the gods. Now again, it's already been proven through ritual that he's not an innately evil deity. However, he's still problematic. He still causes a lot of drama, and this is actually where the entire Amaterasu hiding in the cave takes place. He upsets her. She hides in the cave. Now, going into the details of this is way too long for a video. This would be a future video. But eventually, the different gods convince her to leave the cave, but Susano is forced to leave the presence of the god and wander the Japanese countryside. Now, remember, he is supposed to have he was supposed to have gone to Nenokuni, to Yomi, and become sort of one of the gods of Yomi, or one of the gods of Nenokuni, but he's not doing that yet. He doesn't want to go there. So but he has to leave the presence of the gods, so now he starts wandering Japan. Now, for the Jingunden, when we talk about the Amaterasu in the cave, I do need to note there are some rituals regarding this. There's a lot of teachings and symbolism and ritualism for this. There's implements that are related to calling Amaterasu out of the cave. There's a special kind of spear that's decorated. There's a special kind of Shinto wand with different branches and colored cloths hanging from it. There's a lot of things related to this. So with the three goddesses, there's a lot of stuff. With this event, there's a lot of stuff. But again, it's way too much to go to in this video. But but it's important to know that this is where Susano then goes and wanders the countryside. So the three goddesses are created. Susano does the whole Amaterasu hiding in the cave. That all that happens. That has its own sort of teachings and stuff. And then he has to leave the presence of the god and wander Japan. So his sister has forgave him, but he's got to go. He's been sort of exiled. He wanders around a whole bunch. He eventually ends up in the Izumo area, and this is where, and some of you who are familiar with Shinto, etc., this is where the event of Susano fighting the eight-headed Urochi, the giant serpent. Now, a lot of people, usually say it's eight-headed, but the Jingunden teachings and the Nihon Shoki and etc., 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 actually are very clear that the description of the Urochi is that it's a giant serpent, that it has 8 heads, that it has 8 tails, that it has red eyes, and that it has like moss and trees growing on its back. So it's a very interesting image. Usually when you see the Urochi presented, it's usually only an 8-headed snake. They don't give it 8 tails, they just give it 8 heads, and it's never got the rocks and trees and moss and cypress growing on its back. But the actual description is that 8 heads, 8 tails, red eyes, moss, trees, cypress, it's things growing on its back. Now, that battle between Susano and the Urochi took place, like I said, in Izumo. And also, when he defeats the Urochi, this is also where he finds the sword, which I put on the screen. He finds the Kusanagi sword. that is not its name at the time. It will later become known as the Kusanagi. But he finds a very sacred sword inside one of the inside the Urochi, and then um, he also marries a girl that he saves from the Urochi. So this story is important because one, it gives the great detail of the Urochi, which is like a giant serpent deity. It has its own sort of meanings and symbolism. But this is also where the imperial regalia sword comes from, because once he finds the sword in the serpent, he doesn't really have a use for it. But it's really nice and very powerful. So he actually gives it to his sister. Again, he's not allowed to return to the heavens and stay, but he does deliver the sword to his sister and then goes. So then she gets this sword. This sword will becomes the sword that is the sword of the imperial regalia. And like I said, this is also where he finds a wife and marries his wife. And this is important because of the next god that we're going to look at. Now, before we get to the next deity, which is related to Susano and his wife, I wanted to show you this. This is from the Tachibana Jingunden. And when it gets to the section where it's talking about all of this sort of teachings and symbolism and stuff related to the Susano versus Urochi, this is the diagram that's used. And the first red arrow is the 8 tails. The second red arrow, that's the 8 heads. So this thing is not a 8-headed snake. It's actually 8 heads, 8 tails. So it looks a lot different than it's ever presented. And then also in the purple, you can see where these stations are set up. And if you're familiar with the story, basically Susano had set up these barriers and gateways with poisoned sake behind each one, and essentially got the one head, each one of those stations, one head of the snake went into each one of those stations, and as it drank the poisoned sake, it was poisoned, it was inebriated, etc., etc. And then they were able to sort of trap each head within these stations, and then he was able to go and sever each head. So this is a diagram of that. Now, the important thing about Susano and his wife after this battle, not only is this battle discussed and have a lot of teachings and symbolism in the Jingunden itself, so it is its own teaching, but from this battle he gets married, and from that marriage he produces progeny. And then generations later, after a long series of events, Susano eventually does retire to Yomi, or retires to Nenokuni, the land of the roots, right? The Shinto afterlife. But even that, years later after that, his progeny are still, descending through the ages. So one of his descendants ends up having a run-in with him in Nenokuni. And Susano ends up putting him through a series of trials. His descendant passes all of the trials, and there's a long story here, but eventually ends up being chased by Susano through Nenokuni, which is very interesting because him being chased through Yomi is very similar to Izanami chasing Izanagi through Yomi. Right? Remember when Izanagi went to Yomi to try to save Izanami, but she'd already turned into a goddess of the dead, and gave, already arisen these 8 lightning gods. So she chases him, and he has to flee from her and escape her by running out of Yomi. This same sort of imagery takes place with Susano chasing his descendant through Yomi, and his descendant getting away. And just like when Izanami is yelling at Izanagi, her final sort of things about how she'll kill 1,000 people every day, and then Izanagi responds, well, I will birth 1,500 people every day, that whole event. Similar like that, then when eventually Susano stops chasing his descendant, and he tells his descendant that his descendant shall rule Japan, like rule the land of the living, and that, Susano proclaims his descendant, is now got his blessing to be the ruler of Japan. But he has to change his name, right? Now that he's the ruler of Japan, he needs a new name. And this is the origin of the god Okuninushi. And if you remember, so Okuninushi is Susano's descendant who escapes from him from Yomi. And if you remember, from the Jingunden deity video. This Okuninushi is the god of Izumo, aka the god of the army, as taught in the Genji and the Jingunden text. So remember, in this tradition, the Jingunden, the Tada Genji, the Tachibana, Kusunoki, etc., you have Hachimandai Bosatsu as the god of the samurai, the god of the Genji specifically. The god of war is actually the god of the army, and that is Okuninushi, who is the god of Izumo, who is the descendant of Susano, who is actually the ruler of Japan until the sun goddess decides that her descendant, until the sun goddess's descendants decide to go down to Japan. So let's look at that. So again, Okuninushi is the lord of Japan until the sun goddess's descendant, Ninigi no Mikoto, descends to earth and takes on mortality. If you remember from the deities of the Jingunden video, this was an important point. When Ninigi no Mikoto decides that he's going to become mortal and go down to Japan, this sort of changes things, because until this point, Susano's progeny, which would be Okuninushi, is the ruler of Japan. The god of Izumo is the god of Japan, right? But then Ninigi no Mikoto descends, takes on mortality, and at this point the sun goddess's line takes over as the rulers of Japan. Now, there's a lot of teaching about how before Ninigi descended to earth, the sun goddess sent emissaries and envoys, and there was a lot of diplomacy, for lack of a better word, between the gods of the heavens and the Izumo god of the earth, about basically that the Izumo god of the earth would step back and allow the sun goddess's descendants to become god of all Japan. So meaning that basically the god of Izumo was the god of like Honshu, the mainland Japan, but the sun goddess's descendant was going to be emperor of the entire kingdom of all the islands. And so this was agreed upon, and when this sort of agreement was finalized, then that's when Ninigi no Mikoto descends, takes on mortality, and the sun goddess's line now becomes the rulers of Japan. And this is ultimately, as I said, where Emperor Jimmu comes in, because the first emperor of Japan, Emperor Jimmu, is the direct descendant of Ninigi no Mikoto. So then when Emperor Jimmu decides that it's time to build the empire and start a military campaign to unify all the islands under the descendant of the sun goddess, this is where, at this time, this is where the three goddesses snap into action. Remember, they had been born and given their divine decree, so long ago. And now that Emperor Jimmu is going to use a military campaign to unify the islands, now they are to serve him and protect him, make sure that he wins, etc., etc., etc. And so this is when they activate as the deities of the Jingunden.